Hi everyone, welcome back to Rabbi's Reflection. I'm glad that you're joining with me today. We'll continue our reading of Kitchen Table Wisdom by Dr. Naomi Remen. Today we will be reading the story titled Grandmother Eve. Stay with us as we read through the story and then offer some reflections. When I was small, my grandfather used to tell me stories. Many of these were about women who had lived long ago. Heroic women who learned important things through their mistakes. There was Sarah, whose husband's name was Abraham, Rachel, whose husband's name was Jacob, and Esther, who was a queen. It was only after his death that I found out these stories were Genesis, told by a scholarly, white-bearded Orthodox rabbi to a devoted granddaughter, the child of two young, agnostic socialists. My grandfather's story of Grandmother Eve and the snake is really a story about the importance of the inner life. In the beginning of the story, Grandmother Eve is a little girl, and she lives much as I did then, as a child. God is the Father, and like all fathers, he provides food and shelter and all the things necessary to life. In return, Eve obeys him in the same way I was expected to obey my own daddy. Life goes on in the garden, much the same from day to day. Very little is asked of Eve. All the animals and plants live there together with Eve, including a tree of great beauty in the center of the garden called the Tree of God's Wisdom. God has offered Eve some very clear guidelines about this tree. She can eat the fruits of all the other trees, but the fruit of this tree is forbidden. In the beginning, she accepts this without question, even though the very purpose of life may be to grow in wisdom. As time goes by, even though the garden does not change, Eve changes. She begins to grow up to become a teenager. One day, as she is passing the most beautiful tree, a snake coiled in its branches speaks to her. "Eve," he says, "here is one of the apples of this tree. Why not eat it?" At this point, my grandfather would always explain that the snake was not really a snake, but a symbol for the human yearning for wisdom, the seductive power of the unknown, and the endless fascination that the mysterious has for human beings. The snake is the first teacher, and he addresses that part of Eve which is no longer a little girl, but is a seeker. Eve thinks back upon what God the Father said. The fruit of the tree is forbidden. But Eve is an adolescent. Like most people her age, she needs to find out for herself. She feels the magnetism of the apple. Drawn toward it, she reaches out for it, takes a bite of it. The food we eat becomes a part of every one of our cells and is woven into the very fabric of our being. The apple is no different from any other food, said my grandfather. When Grandmother Eve eats it, the wisdom of God becomes a part of her inner life, a holy wisdom she carries inside her, and not something she speaks to outside of herself. She now carries the voice of God inside every one of her cells like a little compass. As her descendants, so do we. Eating the apple made possible an enormous change in Grandmother Eve's lifestyle. She no longer needed to live in God's house in the nursery in order to be safe. She was able to leave this protected environment because she carried God with her. She could hear him if she was willing to listen. When she ate the apple, she became an adult and gained the freedom of an adult to go out into a world of complexity, adventure, responsibility, and change, to have her own life and make her own choices. Like most children, the literal aspects of the story bothered me. "Why, Grandpa," I asked, "did God tell Grandma Eve that she mustn't eat the apple in the first place if it wasn't true?" One of the finest things about my grandfather was that he did not change his response to a question just because the person asking was very young. He answered me as if I were a fellow Kabbalist. "Neshumala," he said, "this is a most difficult question, a question worthy of much thought. The Bible is full of images of God. God as an authoritarian father, God is a lover, God is angry, God is jealous, God is faithful, God is loving. In one place God is walking on the earth, and in another his breath blows over the waters. In yet another he is a pillar of fire. But God is none of these things. These are all images of God in the minds of men. Knowing God may require us to question all of these things. The God within seemed to require a day-to-day, moment-to-moment sort of inner attention rather than just a simple obedience. I felt sorry for Grandma Eve. It seemed much harder than obedience to me. The complexity of the real world requires us to struggle to hear the holy and develop a personal responsibility to live a good life. It demands that we stay awake. Grandfather presented Eve to me as a grown-up rather than a sinner. It was years before I heard the official version of the story. Perhaps there is something for us now in my grandfather's version of the story. We have expected a great deal of our experts and authorities, our doctors, our politicians, our technicians and our educators, even our rabbis, ministers, and priests. We have offered them obedience for the hope that they would become responsible for providing us with a good life. It is time to find the spot of grace within. How do we tell stories that matter to us to the next generation? Here we see a lovely version of that. We know that if we've been following along with these stories from Dr. Remen, we know that she grew up in a Jewish family, but one that wasn't particularly interested in ritual or religion, but more culturally Jewish. And we've met her figure, the figure of her grandfather, this rabbi, this Orthodox rabbi, mystical in some senses. I'm not forgetting exactly the details of the other stories that we read, but we know that he's a presence there and that they feel a very close connection between grandfather and granddaughter. So he retells her the story of Genesis, or that first story after the creation, about Eve and then Adam eating from the apple and then being banished from the garden. But he tells it in a totally different way. What is similar and what is different than the story that you were told? I imagine for many of us, the story of eating from the apple, or eating from the fruit of the tree, to be more specific, was a story about sin, was a story about doing something wrong. However you wanted to put it, they ate from the tree in which God told them not to eat, and they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. On the face of it, this seems to be not a good thing. But the way that the grandfather retells it is that it's a story about Eve growing up, Eve as the adolescent. I love the sense of seeing the story through this lens, because it gives more grace to Eve. It's compassionate with her. As an aside, I love that her note that her grandfather says that the snake was the first teacher. I never thought of the snake in the story being a teacher, but that's really interesting. But Eve is an adolescent. She needs to find out for herself what it's like. It doesn't matter that God told her not to do it. It doesn't matter about what the rules are. We know, because we've all been adolescents, that you need to find out for yourself. You need to be able to explore for yourself. So the story becomes about wisdom, about wanting to understand what's unknown, about what's mysterious in life. And then because she eats from the the tree, the fruit, and she eats from that tree of wisdom, the wisdom then gets inside of her, and that wisdom is then passed on to all of us. And this wisdom is a wisdom of God. And so now we see the story in a different light. The story isn't necessarily about one in which there's a sin, but perhaps here this is the course of life, where we have to grow up. We have to move from the adolescent stage to the young adult stage. We have to begin to take responsibility for our life. And so too within this spiritual lens, you then have to take responsibility for your relationship with God. Life, as we know it, is not lived in the Garden of Eden. We don't just live in a world where things are perfect, or our relationship with God is just ever present and ever perfect, but it's something that we have to work towards. As Dr. Remen puts it, an inner attention is needed constantly, all the time, to try to cultivate or develop a relationship with God. And so I think just the way that we now view this story, it kind of flips it on its head, from one that is could have been seen as sin, it's now seen as exploration, the consequences of which we have to deal with every day. So I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to hearing from you and your reflections.